r/NoSleep. Posted by u/RyanHatesMilk. If you wake up at 3:33 a.m., don't look outside. Part 1. I have to find out, Marie. Have to end it. Can't go on like this. I still love you. Even if you don't love me back. Look after Lucy. If you wake up at 3:33 a.m., don't look outside. That's what my husband's note said. The note he left before he vanished. Just walked out the house in the middle of the night, and never came back. Front door wide open, his car still parked on the drive, his clothes still hanging in the cupboard. He even left his toothbrush. I suppose I should start at the beginning. It's just hard to know exactly when that was. Liam and I had been married for almost 8 years, but had been having problems for more than half that. After our daughter was born, our sex life fizzled out, and I suppose things spiraled from there. We could never quite get on the same page, and every small thing would inevitably lead to massive arguments. When old frustrations don't get chance to evaporate, they just simmer beneath the surface, and I think we were both guilty of spilling over the edges at the slightest increase of heat. Eventually we simply found it easiest to stay out of each other's way. We each had dominion over different chores. He cooked, I cleaned, and generally the only time we spent together was sleeping. One particular morning, as I stirred from my dreams, I was surprised to find him sat up in bed, propped against the backrest and staring forward into space. Normally once Liam was awake, he was up and about. Maybe it was because of his work, or his outdoor hobbies, but he had always been a morning person. He noticed I was awake and snapped himself out of whatever thoughts he'd been ensnared in. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Just tired," he said, stretching like a bear out of hibernation, as if to exaggerate the point. He clambered out of bed, and paused, as if hesitating whether to tell me something. As he dressed, his voice took on an air of forced casualness. Woke up in the middle of the night, and checked the clock. Tossed and turned for what felt like hours, and when I looked back at the clock, it was still the same time. Must have misread the clock the first time, I yawned, rolling over and closing my eyes. I could hear him muttering to himself as he put his socks on. Something about never believing him about anything. If my eyes were open, I would have rolled them. The rest of that day was normal enough. He took Lucy to school and went to work, and I probably would have forgotten all about it. But after we'd gone to bed, I awoke to a thud in the dead of night. Barely visible in the starlight drifting around the curtains, Liam stood at the foot of the bed, and I sat up, rubbing at my eyes. "What are you doing?" "Stupid phone doesn't work," he snapped. "Not so loud, you'll wake up Lucy," I hissed. "First the clock freezes, now my phone won't turn on," he moaned, albeit quieter. My eyes drifted to the floor where a dim rectangle of light was reflecting off the carpet. "Well, it's on now." Liam stopped pacing and turned around. As he scooped up the phone, its bright screen illuminated his face, wrinkled up in confusion. Must have knocked some sense into it. Using his phone screen as a light source, he walked out of the door, towards the bathroom. "Clock definitely needs new batteries though," he added in a whisper. Stretching over to his side of the bed, I reached over his pillow to the bedside table, and lifted his alarm clock to face me. Its black face showed large, crimson numbers on a digital display, 3:34 a.m. As I squinted at it through the darkness, it flickered to 3:35 a.m., seemed to be working fine to me. I rolled over to my side of the bed and went back to sleep. It was my turn to take Lucy to school that day, and as I got her dressed, Liam made breakfast. Turned out he actually had woken her up when he'd thrown his phone, and he must have felt guilty since he made pancakes. They'd always been Lucy's favorite, probably from one movie or another, and despite Liam's insistence that we're not Americans, we don't have pancakes for bloody breakfast, he knew they were an easy way to make her happy. That was one thing I can't fault my husband for, he did love our daughter. It wasn't often he went out of his way to make her happy, but I suppose he tried when it mattered. But the next morning, he was in a foul mood. "Oh, now she's awake," he grunted sarcastically, when I walked into the kitchen, fastening up my dressing gown. I ignored the comment, it wasn't like I'd slept in overly long. Besides, it was a weekend. I braced myself for a tense breakfast, sat in frosty silence. But as I approached the worktop, my eyes fell on a black screen, covered in splintering hairline cracks. "What happened to your phone?" "Stopped working again," he said, ruffling his newspaper. "Tried knocking some sense into it, like I did the other night, but it didn't work. Then I tried again. A bit harder. Too hard, apparently." "Well, that was stupid," I said, matter-of-factly as I put the kettle on. Liam didn't say anything, But he folded up his newspaper, threw the last dregs of coffee down his throat and left the room. Probably more mad at himself than me. If he'd been mad at me, he would have shot some comment back. He always did like to have the last word. His voice took on a sugary lilt as he bumped into Lucy in the hall. "Morning, darling, didn't wake you up again last night, did I?" "No, Daddy." I suppose I did find it a little strange that my husband had managed to smash his phone without waking either of us, but those thoughts were drowned out by the sheer idiocy of it. With both of us in a mood already, we avoided each other as best as we could. This was always a little bit harder on weekends, and just before we slept, we ended up bickering. "What's that?" I asked, as I saw him place something under his pillow. "A torch." I couldn't help but laugh. "What do you need a torch for?" "To see where I'm bloody going, if I wake up in the night again." "Well, maybe if you kept your anger in check, you'd still have your phone. Maybe if you stopped criticizing me all the time, I wouldn't be so quick to anger." And as simple as that, we descended into an argument that got increasingly personal and ended up with us both rolled over in bed, backs facing each other. When you're mad at someone, even the slightest thing can annoy you. The way they huff out a breath through their nose, or the way they tug at the sheets. Eventually, Liam started snoring. I wasn't far behind. I woke up the next day to an empty bed. I'd assumed my husband would still be in a mood with me, but when I found him that morning, he was completely oblivious. Staring up at the clock above the fireplace, he clutched a collection of watches and alarm clocks in his arms. In the background, the news was on, but he'd got it on mute. "Hey," he said, as soon as I walked in the room. He actually seemed pleased to see me. "Can I look at your phone a second?" What are you doing?" "Just. What time is it?" I told him, and when he shook his head in exasperation, I showed him. "They can't all be wrong," he muttered, setting the bundle in his hands on top of the fireplace, one by one. He left the alarm clock until last, and grabbed it with both hands, raising it into the air to examine. "What are you doing, Liam?" I asked sleepily, making a point of taking my pink watch from his collection. "There was a power cut last night, or something. I think there's been one every night. Even my torch didn't work." I shrugged. "The clocks have batteries, a power cut wouldn't stop them." "You're not listening," he said, shaking his head. "Even my torch didn't work. Nothing worked. That's why my phone wasn't turning on. I tried yours last night, and it wouldn't turn on either." "You were going through my phone last night?" "No," he said, "I was seeing if it worked, and it didn't. Nothing did. Not the lights, not the fridge, not the watches. The only thing in the whole house that was still on was this clock." He raised the little alarm clock in his hands. "And it was stuck on that same time. 3:33 a.m. Are you sure this wasn't a dream?" "It wasn't a bloody dream." "Okay, so there was a power cut last night," I said, making my way towards the door. "Do you want a cup of tea?" "It wasn't just..." he started, rubbing at his brow in genuine exasperation. "Look, I was up for a while. At least an hour, it had to be. And all the while, nothing worked. All the while, this clock said 3:33 a.m. Then, suddenly, everything turned back on, back to normal. And this clock said 3:34 a.m. So, what are you saying?" He gestured wildly to the television, pointing at the little timer at the bottom of the screen and holding up the alarm clock to compare. They both matched, to the minute. "How can it be the same? Where has that time gone?" His movements were so frantic, he looked like he was 2 steps away from frothing at the mouth. "It must have been a dream, Liam. I don't know, call the electric board or something. See if they've had any power cuts. I'm making a cup of tea." "Wasn't a fucking dream," I heard him mutter as he knelt in front of the TV, holding the alarm clock up to the screen and comparing times. I suppose that was the start of his obsession. But at least he was bearable that day. I could tell it was occupying his mind, but he didn't mention it again. Until he woke me up, at least. I think it was the thud that woke me up, more than the whimper. But the whimpering was what made me sit bolt upright. "What the fuck, what the fuck, what the fuck?" Liam's voice drifted over the foot of the bed, and I could barely see the shape of him, scrambling backwards on the floor. The curtains wafted open, moonlight shining through. He must have fallen over, but was still kicking himself away from the window, wide eyes glinting as he shook his head in denial. As I got out of bed and made my way over to him, he flinched and looked up at me. Even in the dim light, I could make out the terror etched on his face. I'd never seen my husband scared like this. "There's someone outside," he sputtered in a frantic whisper. "Someone in a mask or..." "They saw me." They looked right at me. I rose and peeked out of the curtains myself. Our quiet street looked normal to me. Parked cars, street lights and the houses opposite. I scanned around, looking for people, but came up short. "There's nobody out there," I said, letting the curtain fall back. Liam clambered to his feet and shoved the curtain aside, getting his whole body in front of the window. He searched the empty street with both hands pressed against the glass. "I saw someone," he muttered. "I bloody saw someone." As I got back into bed, I glanced at the alarm clock on Liam's side of the bed. 3:35 a.m. The next day was my turn to take Lucy for school, and I didn't see much of Liam all day, despite not going out of my way to avoid him. In the evening, I caught him fitting extra locks on the doors, a deadbolt on front and back. I had to bite my tongue not to say anything, but knew it would just cause a fight. Besides, we lived in an okay neighborhood, but maybe a bit of extra caution wouldn't go amiss. What if Liam had seen someone out there, looking to rob us, or hurt us? I stirred that night to find the bed empty. A quick glance around the room told me Liam was elsewhere. Since I was already awake, I decided to go to the bathroom, and on the landing I bumped into my husband, walking up the stairs. Even in the dim light, I could see him try to hide something behind his back. "What's that?" I asked, before he could open his mouth. "Nothing," he muttered. I walked down the steps to see what he was hiding, but he twisted and grabbed my arm with his free hand. "Go to bed," he hissed. "What have you got? Is that a crowbar?" "It's nothing," he said, but dropped any pretense of hiding it now I'd guessed correctly. The tool fell to his side, glinting in the darkness. "Go to bed." "Fucking psycho," I spat in disbelief, stepping away from him. "Well, it's a good job I had it. Someone was trying to open our door. I must have scared them off." Someone was trying to get inside? "Yeah, I could hear them trying the handle." I'd hoped that would be the end of it, but was sorely mistaken. Liam's nightly obsession only became worse and worse. He was tetchier than ever, snapping at the smallest thing. It was clear he wasn't getting enough sleep, and if it wasn't for me urging him on, he would have been much later for work, if he went in at all. Not that I got any thanks for it. I became the object of his anger. What was happening was somehow my fault. I didn't believe him. Wouldn't help him. "Wake me up then, if it's so bad," I said one day. "Don't you think I've tried that? I've shook you, slapped you, but you won't wake up until it's over. Until he's gone." "Until who is gone?" I asked, cautiously processing what he was trying to tell me. He'd slapped me? Subconsciously I rubbed at my cheek. Surely I'd have felt it if my husband had been slapping me in my sleep. Surely I would have a mark or even a bruise. Liam wasn't exactly a small man. But it also wasn't like him to hurt me. He could be a prick, sure, but he'd never purposefully hurt me before. "Forget it," he muttered. The alarm woke me up, beeping in the darkness. As soon as I rose to turn it off, Liam's hand pressed it down to silence it. He was fully dressed, and standing on his side of the bed. He had the crowbar clutched in one hand. What time is it?" I asked blearily, still half asleep. "You told me to wake you up. I can't do it once it starts, but maybe it'll work if you're awake before." He stalked towards the window and opened the curtain a crack with his crowbar, peeking through. "For God's sake, Liam." But I got up, all the same. If it would keep him quiet and get him back to some normality, I'd tolerate it. It was hard to believe I found myself wanting the old Liam back. This new version was making me see how good we'd had it before. 3:32 a.m., the clock read. Standing on the other side of the curtain, I pulled it open and peered outside. Nothing except our quiet road, street lights casting an artificial haze across asphalt pavement. A distant rumble of a car, speeding along a connecting road, unseen. "So what am I looking for, exactly?" I asked. Liam didn't reply, so I kept watching the streets outside. And watching. And watching. Shaking my head, I eventually pulled my head away from the curtain and turned to Liam. But he wasn't there. I looked around the room. He wasn't here at all. I'd never heard him leave. A quick glance at the clock told me it was 3:38 a.m.